the second part, as I said, which is, uh, I mean, in the first half, I was sort of talking about the argumentation frameworks, and then suggested that you can develop argument game proof theories, which you could then generalize to dialogues, and then we get into kind of communication between computational agents, and as I'll suggest, also between human agents. So, in some sense, you could, if you're looking at crowdsourcing or ontologies, you could imagine computational and human agents submitting and engaging arguments to resolve conflicts in the underlying data sets or in these ontologies, right? So that's just a little bit of intuition pumping for those who come from those kind of communities. See if you can relate what I'm going to talk about now um, to argumentation-based dialogues, to your particular area of expertise. So first, argument game proof theories, and then I'll show how you can generalize these to dialogical models, models of dialogue. So far, as I said, we've seen how given an argumentation framework, we can define when a given set E, a subset of these args, is an extension under the admissible, grounded, preferred semantics. And as I said, there are many other semantics, but we'll stick with those. So of course, I mean, what I've done is I've just said, okay, these are like declarative conditions that identify that what properties a set must satisfy to be a preferred extension, for example, that it's maximal complete, or the grounded, it's the smallest complete extension. But of course, there are some particular decision questions we want to ask, like, does an extension exist, or give all extensions, for which we need algorithmic procedures, right? We need to be able to answer these kind of questions. And in particular, is an argument X, so this is the question I'm going to focus on now, is an argument X contained in an extension? Okay. To answer this question, we can employ argument game proof theories for deciding whether an X is in a given extension, say the grounded extension. So remember this situation here where I discussed the added value of argumentation as allowing distributed reasoning, agents with their own knowledge bases. Now, what I'm going to do, as I said, is now talk about argument game proof theories that decide whether a given argument X is in a preferred or the grounded extension. And the way we do this is using games, argument games. Supposing you want to know whether X, the argument X, is in an extension of a framework. Okay? You want a decision procedure. We can use a game, a two-player game, where you have a proponent that moves X. Then, by the way, remember, we have an argument framework. So this is referencing you've got a given argument framework. There's an argument X in the framework. Proponent says, I want to know whether X is in, I want to demonstrate, the proponent wants to demonstrate that X is in, say, the grounded extension. Then opponent will look at the framework and say, oh, this Y attacks X. So opponent will then move Y as a counter move, attacking argument. Of course, pro can then move an argument Z in the framework that attacks Y. And so on. Op can then maybe, if in the framework there is a counter argument to Y, op can move Y, and so on. So it's fairly obvious. You have the two players, proponent, opponent, they reference the argument framework and they move attacks. If at any stage in the game, so this is giving you the basic idea of the game, right? If at any stage in the game, a player is stuck, in other words, if there is an argument moved and there is no attacking argument, the player can backtrack to a previous argument of the other agent, of pro-op, and try an alternative line of counter-argument by looking at the framework. If proponent successfully counterattacks every attack by opponent, such that that proponent move cannot itself be counterattacked, the proponent has won. Right? So they're looking at the framework, they're moving arguments. If every line of dispute, right, if every line of counter-argument tried by op the opponent, is successfully countered by proponent having the last say, the last move, then proponent has won. That's the basic idea of the game. So I'm going to give you an example. Let's look at this framework here. Okay? Proponent says, I want to prove that A is in an extension. So proponent moves A. I would say con. That should pro-con. It could be opponent. Sorry, I mean, right? So it's op, pro-op, or pro-con. Pro-A, con-A. For and against. So con or op could then look at the art and say, okay, I can move B. Then pro says, oh, I can move C to counterattack your B. And con says, I can move D. Now at this stage, proponent, looking at the framework, can't counter D. So he backtracks and says, oh, but I've got an alternative counter-argument to your B, looking at the framework, which is E. So he moves E. Then con says, oh, but I backtrack now. Okay, pro has successfully counterattacked B, so I can now backtrack and successfully counterattack A with another argument, F. Now at this stage, proponent can't find a counterattack to F. So pro loses. Intuitively, there is no way of defending A against F. So A is not in an extension. Now also notice that what we have here are three disputes. So you could think of this as the game tree rooted in A. We have three lines of dispute. This dispute, basically disputes are paths from root to leaf in the game tree. Right? So we have this dispute, this path, and we have this dispute. Okay? So that's not the whole story. Now, I've just given you a kind of a very kind of brief overview of an argument game, yeah? But it depends. The rules of the game vary depending upon whether you want to show that the argument is in a preferred extension or in the grounded extension. So in the grounded game, where pro tries to show that the root argument x is in the grounded extension, in that game, there is a restriction on pro. When it comes, there's a rule that restricts pro's moves, and the rule is pro cannot repeat an argument in the same line of dispute. You remember I was talking earlier about the grounded extension? About the burden of proof being higher because pro can't reuse its own argument that's been attacked to defend itself. Do you remember that? And that equates with this restriction on pro. In the same line of dispute, if I start with x and y, z, I can't, again, use x. Okay? In the preferred game, where pro tries to show that the root argument is in a preferred extension of the framework, the rules are reversed. Op, or con, whatever, op cannot repeat an argument in the same dispute. I'll explain why in a second. So you remember this example. We had this framework. We had two preferred extensions, AD and BD. Okay? And the empty set was a grounded extension. Why? Because when pro tries to defend D, it tries to defend with an argument that must counterattack with A, but then A must defend itself against B, and vice versa. He can also try B, but then B must defend himself against A. So as I said, the grounded semantics places a higher burden of proof. In defending an argument X, one cannot use X to directly or indirectly defend itself. In other words, can't you move X in the same line of dispute? In the preferred game, we have a rule preventing op from repeating in the same line of dispute. Why is that rule there? Because otherwise the game could go on forever, infinitely. Furthermore, intuitively, supposing I've got X, right? There's X attacking Y and Y attacking X. Pro moves X, op moves Y. Because it's a preferred game, I can reuse X to attack your Y. Now what if op moves y again, and then I move x, and then op moves, etc. ad infinitum? So we stop what op from repeating. I've already defended against your y with my x. So x, y, x. Okay, that's it. I've done my job. No point you moving y and then me moving x again. I've already shown that I can defend your y. Okay. So let's see how that works. Let's have a look at that example. Is A in a preferred extension? Here's the framework. Remember, there are two preferred extensions corresponding to that dilemma where you can say, okay, A is winning, A is in one preferred extension, B is in another preferred extension. So supposing A, Pro, wants to show that A is in a preferred extension, which we know it is. Pro moves A, op moves B, because B attacks A. Pro can repeat in the preferred game, so moves A. In this dispute, op cannot now repeat B, Pro has won. But if op moved B, then Pro could move A, then op could move B ad infinitum. That explains why this game ends there. Pro wins. There is a preferred extension, the set A, that contains A. A is in a preferred extension. Is that fairly clear or fairly intuitive? No, the choice, basically, remember, the decision question is an argument, given a framework, is X in the grounded or a preferred extension? So if you're asking whether the membership of X in an extension, Pro plays that argument. The proponent is trying to demonstrate, look, I can show by countering all possible counterattacks that X is in a preferred or the grounded extension. Now let's have a look at this framework. Do you remember that there were two preferred, D was in both preferred extensions, AD and BD. Okay, so supposing Pro wants to show that D is in a preferred extension. So Pro moves D, op counterattacks with C, Pro moves A, op moves B because B attacks A. Because we're playing the preferred game, op can repeat A. Now, op can't repeat B. Op cannot repeat in the same dispute line. Game over. Pro has shown that D is in a preferred extension. Of course, the game could have evolved another way. Pro wins. At this stage, Pro moves D, op moves C. Now, instead of Pro moving A to attack C, Pro could have chosen B. An alternative game would have been this. Pro moves B, op moves A, Pro moves B, op cannot repeat A, game over.
Why is that an alternative game? Why is it not the case that they have to consider both branches within the whole game?
Right, so if we go back, supposing we're here, Pro wins. So the idea, of course, that we could have alternative branches or alternative disputes are generated by backtracking moves, where a player says, okay, I've run out, I can't attack A. But there is no other argument that op could move. But op has moved C. So op can't, yeah, so exactly. So op would have to find an alternative to one of Pro's moves, D or A, and there aren't any. I mean, B could be moved, but B is prevented from being moved because it's a repetition. In this game, because, okay, so imagine there was no bias in favor. So imagine now op could move B against A. So imagine that op is allowed to repeat. So op says, okay, I've attacked your A with a B. You've repeated A. I'm going to repeat B. Then Pro could repeat A. Then op could repeat B ad infinitum. Okay, it's not sad, but here, okay, that's a pragmatic reason. The kind of more conceptual reason is that A has already defended himself against B by using A itself. So Pro, sorry, has already said, okay, I have a counter argument to your B, which is my A. So, in other words, pro has already fulfilled their burden of proof. The burden of proof allowing pro to move the same argument that was attacked. It's got a lower burden of proof. They can repeat A, okay, as a defense against its own attacker, B. Okay, so yeah.
There is a symmetry. It's just two different games.
Yeah. So in the grounded game, where there's a higher burden of proof, here, remember that the grounded extension was empty. Okay, so if pro moves D, op moves C, pro moves A, op moves B, B attacks A. Now, pro cannot repeat A, because in the grounded game, pro can't use the argument A itself to defend itself. Okay? So then what happens? How does the game continue now? Well, yeah.
Brings the other argument into play.
So pro says, okay, look, I can't counterattack your B, so I'm going to backtrack. Are there any other arguments I could move further up the line of dispute? And there is. C could be attacked by B, so pro moves B. Op now moves A. Now, remember, in the grounded game, op cannot repeat. So pro cannot repeat B. Just like pro can't repeat A here. Here, pro has used B, but pro can't repeat B. So pro loses. So in other words, every line of dispute has been explored. And in every line of dispute, subject to the restriction on the moves, which are symmetric between the two games, pro has not successfully countered all of op's moves, not had the last laugh, if you like. I know. It looks, because, okay, the idea is that op has to succeed in at least one branch. Okay, so once one branch has failed, op can then try another branch, and pro, it's sufficient that pro shows that, okay, so here's the argument C by op. Although this fails, if supposing we had that, there was no A. Although the op argument by C has not been successfully defended on this dispute, it has been successfully defended on this dispute. So then pro would win. There is at least one way, right, of having the last laugh against op's argument C.
I think this does look very counterintuitive, because you're using the argument that was used against you.
So, I know.
But an intuition, you can get an intuition from a practical example. Supposing there was a court case and there were two defendants accused of murder, and one said, each of them said the other one did it. So, the prosecution would say, well, A did it, and the defense would say, well, B says. I'm getting it the wrong way round. So, prosecution said A did it, and then the defense would say, oh, but A said B did it, and then vice versa. So then you couldn't convict either, because there wasn't any evidence that was strong enough to convict them both. So I think that's the sort of situation in which this might arise. Yes, that would be. Yeah. So it is. It's not completely unintuitive.
Yeah, I mean, actually, and also, basically, the idea is the idea that you need to kind of identify a winning strategy. I'll explain in a second. The idea of a winning strategy will perhaps address your point. Okay, how about this example? We want to show that A is in a preferred extension. So pro moves A, op moves B. Pro moves D, op moves E. pro can repeat D, yeah, given this framework. Is that pretty clear? Now at this stage, what can op do? Yeah. Backtrack and say, okay, I've got another possible counterattack to your A, C. And pro moves E, D. And pro repeats E, if allowed to in the preferred game. Now op can't counterattack. So, pro has won, right? A is in a preferred extension. Should pro win? Look at, so pro has moved, so this can't come to your point. Pro has moved D and E. When you look at these games, what you effectively pro is doing is they're building, in the course of a game, building an extension, a subset of the preferred extension around the argument A. So it's like the S, the set S of the preferred, the arguments moved by pro are a subset of the preferred extension. What do we know about preferred extensions? They are maximal complete. They are also admissible. What do we know about admissible extensions? They have to be conflict-free. Now notice, pro, in the two branches, has moved arguments D and E that attack each other. So actually, pro doesn't win the game, because pro has contradicted himself by moving arguments that attack each other. So in the grounded game, if pro wins, the arguments moved by pro are a subset of the grounded extension. In a preferred game, the arguments moved by pro, if pro wins, are a subset of the preferred extension. Oh, sorry, grounded and preferred. Actually, it turns out that if pro wins the grounded game, you are guaranteed that the arguments moved by pro are conflict-free. One can prove that. I won't go into the details of that. In the preferred game, you need this extra check. And that sort of, unfortunately, disrupts the symmetry of the rules. I mean, I would love to have defined. I mean, I defined these games in a book chapter with a colleague, and we tried hard to get complete symmetry, but between the two games, so that the rules are symmetrical, repetition rules, yeah. But you need this extra check in the preferred game. Yeah, I know, not very nice. Okay, so that explains. So, okay, so now let's just summarize. Okay, so. Defining the grounded game. X is in the grounded extension if and only if there is a game tree with root X, the root argument, such that if pro moves Y in a dispute, a path of the tree, and there is a Z that attacks Y, then op must move that Z. Grounded game. If op moves Y in a dispute, and there is a Z that attacks Y, then pro must move that Z against Y unless Z already exists in the dispute. So here's the non-repetition on op. On a pro. Pro can only move a Z against Y if Z does not appear already in the dispute. That's the rule, yeah? And finally, there is a subtree of this whole tree T prime, such that each op argument is attacked by a pro argument. And this subtree is called a winning strategy. Okay, I'll explain. Look at this example. Pro moves A, op moves B. Pro moves C, op moves D. Yeah? Pro backtracks and moves E. Now, we can identify a subtree such that every op argument is successfully counterattacked. Pro wins. That's the winning strategy. Even though not every dispute, if you go down here, it ends in op. If we go here, it ends in E. Not every dispute is won by pro. But we can identify a subtree such that every argument moved by op is successfully counterattacked. This is the winning strategy. So intuitively, pro has tried to say, well, okay, I can defend my A with a C. I fail in my attempt because you have a D. So let me try an alternative. Let me now try an alternative way of defending A with E. If there's at least one way to defend my A, then I'm successful. And this is what the winning strategy identifies, that there is at least one way for every argument moved by op.
Because the subtree ABC would not be enough, right? Because it excludes D.
Yes.
So you have to say something about leaves being included.
Yeah. Okay. But in the subtree, every argument moved by pro is not counterattacked as well. So pro has one. So if we chose ABC, that T prime would not be a winning strategy because pro hasn't won that dispute because there was an argument by op.
Draw the tree such you exclude D. You'd have to be careful that you're not allowed to draw that tree such that it excludes D.
Right,
otherwise, it would look as if you won when you hadn't.
Yeah, and of course the rules the game is defined such that if op could move an argument, it must be in the tree. So the D must be there by the rules of the game, the way it's defined. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So I hope that's given a flavour of how these argument games work in order to show membership of an argument in an extension. Are there any questions? I mean, it may not be that some of the subtleties may have escaped some, let's say, but the general principle, I hope, is reasonably clear. There are some, I know that there are a lot of questions that are raised, and some of them have already been arisen. And, offline we could talk a bit more about these subtleties, and I've tried to kind of gloss over them in some points and answer them in others. But that's the basic idea of the game. The preferred game, it's the same as a grounded game, but here we have the non-repetition rule on op. Op can move Z against Y only if Z does not already occur in D. So we just switch the non-repetition. And we have the additional, there is a T prime that's a winning strategy, and the arguments moved by pro and T prime do not attack each other. Remember I showed you that extra condition, that pro has not contradicted himself. Okay, so here's some more on games. I mean, one can, for example, gain extra efficient games by having other rules. That's the basic game I've defined, the basic games. One can, for example, prevent pro from moving arguments in a dispute that attack arguments pro has already moved. So there are many ways of shortening the games for efficiency reasons. Okay, and here's some references to other games. Okay, so let's go back to this sort of slide. From argument game to dialogue, I want to show now and describe to you how can we take these argument games and generalize them to dialogues where we're not just moving argument and counter argument. It's not that we have a framework here and we move argument and counter argument. Rather we have agents with their own knowledge where they not only submit arguments but other kinds of locutions. It's not they say, I argue A since BG. No, I argue not G since PQ. Okay? So let's see how we can generalize these games to dialogues. Okay. Now, the first thing when we talk, well, there's a number of steps, and I'm just going to give it, there's a lot of work on dialogues. I'm going to give you just an overview of how these dialogues generalize argument games. So, as I said, the moves in a dialogue are not defined with respect to an existing argument framework. Rather, each agent builds arguments from its own knowledge base, and these implicitly define the framework. So remember the argument game, we had an existing argument framework instantiated by a set of formulae and a logic, and then pro and op referenced the framework and said, okay, given there's an attack there, I can move it. Now we don't have an existing framework. We just have an agents constructing arguments from their own knowledge and moving them. Yeah? The arguments that they move, just like here, these arguments define a framework. It's by the process of moving that the framework is constructed. Not that you have a framework and you play the game with respect to the framework, but rather they move the arguments, and during the course of the dialogue, the framework is constructed. And we're going to focus more on the persuasion dialogues, right? Where one agent is trying to persuade somebody of the truth, another agent of the truth of an assertion. So Agent 1 successfully persuades Ag 2 that alpha is true if the initial argument Ag1 that Ag1 moves, just like X here for Q, is a justified argument in the framework that's incrementally constructed via the process of moving argument and counter-argument. So the agents move arguments in the course of a dialogue. You construct the framework from the arguments move. If the initial argument moved by Ag1 is a justified argument, Ag1 has persuaded the other agent that the claim of that initial argument is true. Okay? I'll give you an example in a second of how that works. Right? So that's the second thing. I mean, these 2 points are very much related. The third thing to note is that dialogues don't just, as I said, involve moving arguments. You know, what we call the locutions in a dialogue framework are not just argue locutions, but they're of the form, I claim alpha is true, or why is alpha true, or okay, I concede that such and such is true, or I'm going to retract my claim. Okay, so let's have a look at an example. So Paul starts in this style. My car is very safe. Paul is making a claim. Olga, why is your car safe? Ask him to justify that claim with an argument. Paul, since it has an airbag. So can you see that implicitly, it's a bit of a clue about where I'm going, implicitly, because of the why elocution, Paul has submitted an argument. Car is safe because airbag. Paul hasn't moved it in one go. He started with the claim, was asked to justify the claim with a why elocution, and then provided the supporting reason. Olga says, okay, I concede, that is true. I concede the premise, but I disagree that this makes your car safe. The newspapers recently reported on airbags expanding without cause. Olga has stated a counter-argument to this premise. Paul, yes, I concede, that is what the papers say, but that doesn't prove anything since newspaper reports are very unreliable sources of technological information. So now Paul is attacking the counter-argument of Olga, where that argument of Olga attacked Paul's premise. Notice this is a full argument. Olga now says, well, but offers an alternative counter-argument to the initial claim. Still, your car is not safe since its maximum speed is very high. What this dialogue illustrates, amongst other things I'll come to, is the idea that you can have other locutions as well as full arguments, whole arguments being moved as a locution in a dialogue. You can have locutions that make just assert a claim, or locutions that question why, or locutions that concede. Okay, so in generalizing argument games to dialogue, we define a communication language which maps out the space of legal locutions, consisting of a speech act. And so here we get relationships with kind of speech act theory and the usual FIPA agent communication languages, right? So so the argumentation community has developed has used FIPA type protocols for communication to develop locutions that can be used in argumentation-based dialogues. Right? So we have different kinds of different speech acts, such as argue, claim, why, and then the content of the locution. Speech act plus content equals locution. So here's an example. So agent 1, from their logic program, says claims Q. Agent 2, from their says YQ. Agent 1, Q since P not S, and I've got the fact P. So Remember those those arguments from logic program, from the logic, okay? Okay. So the agent 2 says, okay, I concede the premise of your argument for Q, that P is true, but I have a counter argument to your S. Remember, in logic program, an argument attacks another if it claims something that the other argument assumed not provable. Then agent 1 counter argues this argument with G since M, and I've got the fact M. Okay, so now what I'm doing is I'm taking that the basic kind of, so we start with a logic program, we build arguments and attacks. Now I'm generalizing it to multiple agents, building arguments from their own theories, but in addition to arguments, they can have other kinds of locutions like claim, why, concede. Okay. Okay. So now, as well as defining a communication language, these dialogues also require protocols to specify rules governing the reply structure. I mean, they're not dissimilar to some of the protocols David described yesterday. Okay, so and these protocol rules, so the protocols for the dialogues, generalize the rules of the argument games. Remember, in the argument game, we had the non-repetition rules. Now we have other rules in addition. So let's give examples. We can have protocols that are single or multi-move, whether a player can make more than one move at the same time. So if we looked at this example, agent 2 at this stage makes 2 moves, concede P and the move argue S since not G. It's a multi-move protocol. Okay. Protocols can be distinguished as to whether they are unique or multi-reply. Effectively, what that means is can the agent backtrack? As might be suggested, a unique reply means no backtracking allowed. A multi-reply means backtracking allowed. So in the dialogue between Paul and Olga, you remember that we went through this dialogue. Then Olga, at some point, backtracked and said, okay, but your car is still not safe since its maximum speed is very high. So Olga is backtracking to the initial claim made by Paul. So this is an example of a multi-reply protocol. Okay, and then there are other general common sense protocol rules, such as one cannot reply to one's own move. And if you backtrack, then you backtrack with a different reply. There's no point, obviously, backtracking with the same reply that you tried the first time. Okay? So just like here, there's no point Olga backtracking to this move here with the same move, why is your car safe? Otherwise, it just goes on.
So it seems to me Paul 3 is a different kind of argument from ones that you've used in the past. So your arguments have been at the object level and have said, I'm going to attack the premise of one of your claims with a claim of my own. But this one says the form of argument is not logically correct. I mean, I was going to ask you about this at the end, but some attacks are sort of meta-level attacks that say, the logic you've used is not actually a valid logic for my argument.
Thank you for bringing it up. I glossed over it. Yeah. This is called an undercut attack. John Pollock, developed this notion of an undercut that, given a defeasible rule, so for example, a defeasible rule might be the following. To give an example, if the object looks red, defeasibly, presumably, it is red. That inference step can itself be counterattacked, can be argued against. In other words, you are doing a meta-level attack. You are denying the inferential jump from looks red to is red. And this is called an undercut attack. So an undercut attack might be the object is illuminated by a red light. The fact that the object is illuminated by a red light undercuts or denies the inferential step from looks read to is read. And that's exactly what that kind of attack is.
A particular inference. So you're undercutting a rule of, beta implies alpha, looks read is read. Whereas this is saying newspaper reports are not valid arguments. So the analogy I was going to use was supposing you having a mathematical argument and I was trying to construct a constructive proof, and you came in with a classical argument, and I could say you've just invoked the law of excluded middle, which I don't recognize as a valid rule. So I'm attacking your logic. Or it could be, you use the probabilistic logic, and I'm not allowing probability here. You've only argued your claim to some probability, so I'm not going to accept that claim. So that seems to me more at sort of meta level about the form of logic
yes, exactly.
that's being used.
That's saying, I'm not playing by the rules of your game.
Exactly.
In a way, yeah. It's a bit like, I think I brought this up at dinner yesterday, in the science of memetics, where memes are ideas that withstand that gain purchase in our brains or our minds because they're useful for our own survival. I don't know if we talked about memetics, and some memes or some ideas are particularly good at defending themselves from being dislodged from our brains. One is a religious meme, because if somebody comes up with a counter meme argument saying, well, show me the evidence for the existence of God, then the person might say, well, it's not a matter of rationality, it's a matter of faith. So I'm not even playing by the rules of the game. It reminds me a bit of that, yeah. Okay. Okay. Sorry, yeah.
I can see the fact denying the possibility to attack your own arguments if you do strategical argumentation. But why you need something like that in dialogue? Because it's kind of deny honesty in dialogue. So say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. That's why.
There are dialogues which model deception. In fact, there is even a dialogue. There's even argument-based dialogues modeling bullshitting. There is a paper, Logic, Lies, and Bullshit, which basically kind of tries to, which basically suggests that that people implicitly are attacking themselves. They're just kind of inconsistent. Actually, that's lying. That's more lying, where they an inconsistency in their own argument. Their arguments implicitly attack an argument they've already moved, given their existing knowledge. There are a whole variety of different kinds of dialogue that model these kinds of deception and lying and bullshitting that involve that, where you can have possibly arguments attacking your own arguments.
In this case, and the question was why you need to specify this kind of constraint in dialogues. It cannot
because currently the dialogues I'm presenting are normative. They prescribe. They describe rules for conducting dialogue in a rational way. It's irrational to basically attack your own argument that you've moved in a dialogue. Right? So,
if you consider lack of knowledge of the agents, they will themselves revise their own argument when they know something new.
of course, we're assuming that at the time when my argument in a dialogue with you attacks my own argument, given all the knowledge I know, I'm inconsistent. It may, of course, be the case that I may acquire further knowledge that actually means that my argument isn't a counterattack. But at the time, I can accept it might be revised, my knowledge, such that my argument doesn't counterattack my own argument. But that's not something, that's more about the dynamics. Okay, but it could be the case that in the course of a dialogue, I learn something that denies the fact that my argument attacks my own argument. I learn something else. Okay. So we talked about a whole set of rules: multi-move, single move, multi-reply, single reply, and common sense protocol rules. And then there are legal reply rules specific to the communication language. Okay, let me give you some examples. So a legal reply to a move claim alpha. I claim alpha. What the protocol determines certain replies that are legally allowed. For example, if I claim alpha, my interlocutor might say Y alpha, or concede alpha, or claim not alpha, or argue not alpha since, so on. Obviously, retract alpha is not a legal reply. If I claim alpha, what sense does it make for you to retract it? I am the only one that can retract something I've asserted. Okay? So there are rules on legal replies. So a legal reply to a Y alpha, legal replies are retract and argue. Retract alpha, argue alpha. So I claim alpha, Alan says Y alpha. My legal replies are that I can retract alpha, say, okay, I give up the ghost, or I can give an argument for alpha. Other rules may refer to previous locutions. If you concede alpha, then later you can't query it. So I claim alpha, you say, okay, concede, I accept. It doesn't make sense after that for you to then say, well, why alpha? Actually, maybe it does in some cases. I might concede and later on actually look for an argument why. So, that's debatable. Also, if I retract alpha, I can't then later, if I concede alpha, I say, yeah, I accept alpha is true. It doesn't make sense for me then to claim not alpha is true. I'm contradicting myself. Okay. There are some rules that can refer to the contents of the agent's knowledge bases. So, for example, an agent can only move claim alpha if an agent from its own knowledge base can construct a justified or an argument for alpha. Now, this is a bit more controversial, and can anybody sort of suggest a reason why these kinds of rules are more controversial? So the legality of me claiming alpha is dependent on my knowledge base. But the protocols are kind of public. Ideally, there should be minimal reference to the internal contents of the agent's knowledge base or in the human context brain. Right? These are sort of public protocols. Okay? So they're minimal reference. Of course, that then allows for not lying, deception. So I can claim alpha and actually believe not alpha. That by not insisting on this rule, I can actually deceive and lie. And that's a whole other area of research. Okay. All right. So far, we've seen how a framework for dialogue can be understood as generalizing argument games to include a communication language, enabling moves which don't just involve the submission of arguments, but other kinds of assertions, other kinds of locutions. And I've discussed how, in effect, actually a dialogue manager, not quite the same kind of dialogue manager as the ones David talked about yesterday, but basically similar in the sense that they enforce a protocol. The protocol has a number of rules that license how the dialogue can legally evolve. Okay. We've already seen how the outcome of an argument game is determined. In other words, by who has won, pro or con, in an argument game. We've seen that. How, now the question is, how do we decide the outcome of a dialogue? Agents communicating with these locutions. How do we decide whether one agent has successfully persuaded another agent that alpha is true? Okay? Or like Paul, how can we decide that Paul has successfully persuaded Olga that the car is safe? And that's what I'm going to talk a bit about now. One way, one approach requires is that the initial claim is explicitly conceded. So here's this dialogue. Remember this dialogue. Agent 1 claims Q. There are some locutions in the dialogue, and at some point, Agent 2 says, okay, I concede. Q is true. You've persuaded me. I've tried to argue against your argument. You've given an argument countering my argument. I can't say any more. I can't counter what you've argued, so I concede. That's one way. Some people, model dialogues outcomes in this way. But a more principled way is the following. Well, first of all, let's take a step back. This is maybe not as principled a way as one would like, because this depends. I mean, the agent too might just not concede. say, I'm not going to concede. I mean, this is quite common, right? When you're having vigorous discussions and debates, and people are obstinate and kind of want to hold on to their position, refuse to concede, and you're banging their head with logic, but the logic doesn't get through. Right? We've all experienced this, to our chagrin. So, Agent 2 might refuse to concede. So this is not exactly a principled way, let's say. I mean, a more principled way would be the following. What you do is record all the asserted contents of the locutions in a commitment store. So as the dialogue proceeds, everything that's been asserted in the locutions, Q, argue Q, since P, argue, they all get, the knowledge contained in the locutions gets put into a commitment store. That commitment store is just like your logic programming knowledge base in this example. It's your delta. From delta, you construct the argument framework from that knowledge, and you determine, is there a justified argument for this claim? If there is, if there is a justified argument, say under the grounded semantics for claim Q, then agent 1 has persuaded agent 2 that Q is true. So now you can begin to see the connection with argument frameworks. Let's see how that works. Look at this dialogue. Agent claims Q. Agent 2 says Y. Agent 1 says Q since P, not SP. Agent 2 says YP. Why? So now agent 2 is questioning a premise of the argument for Q. Agent 1 says P since M. Agent 2 now backtracks and says, okay, I've got an argument against S, proving S. And your earlier argument for Q assumed that S is not provable. So what happens is, these assertions, these knowledge in the assertional locutions, not the Y, which are non-assertional, they don't state, not asserting things, they're just questioning, they get put into a commitment store. So as the dialogue proceeds, this rule, QP not S, gets put in the commitment store. And then after asking YP, an argument is given for the premise P. P since M. And then I've got the fact M. So I've got M. P is true since M is true. M. Then agent 2 says, okay, I've got an argument S since not G. So the rule S since not G gets put into the commitment store. Now let's construct the argument framework from this knowledge. Okay. And these are the arguments we get. We have an argument for Q, if Q, which says Q if P not S, P if M, and the fact M. And we have an argument from the knowledge base, S if not G. This argument attacks this argument. So the argument claiming Q is not justified in the framework. So agent 2 is currently winning the dialogue. Sure.
Strictly related, but I can see sort of some common things that happen in human argumentation happening here, such as why and counterattacking and so forth. What I wanted to ask you if you have a way to deal with arguments that are not really arguments. So, for example, if say my car is very safe, and then why, and then the argument because it is blue. So, okay, no, then you're not saying, no, it is red, it is blue, but it's not relevant.
It's irrelevant, and it's a sort of ridiculous line of argument. I mean, it's the sort of argumentation you get on online forums. No, but really, okay. I mean, no, I mean, there is work, but that's looking at valid lines of patterns of reasoning, but that's more in the kind of natural language community. And there are some there are some attempts to kind of join the two communities together, right? But they're quite early on in terms of how advanced they've got, how far they've got.
Okay, so
talking with Raquel earlier.
So in the argumentation, there is that argument is not relevant. That is not something. Okay.
Because it would require some natural language understanding.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, but that doesn't get over the natural language problem. So no, which was the question was, if I claim my car is safe, somebody says why, and I say because it's blue, you will need that. The fact that my car is blue is not, of course, a relevant reason for why the car is safe. There would need to be some serious kind of natural language processing to semantic understanding to appreciate the fact that that reason is not a valid reason for. Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, there has to be kind of rich semantic.
But you could at least, I mean, there are at least frameworks where you can model. I mean, once you know that there is a relative strength of arguments or how likely the audience is to accept an argument, then there are kind of mathematical ways or formal ways to account for that.
I can't really think. I'm not sure it's much to do with argument strength. This is what I'm confused about.
Well, what I mean is that, when there is no logical reason why something would rebut something else or be stronger than something else, then you can capture other factors by kind of having rules that resolve these conflicts when two things are logically contradict each other. Now, that doesn't solve the problem of transduction of the knowledge into that formalism, but you can kind of somehow account for the forces that are at play.
Okay, it might be. I mean, maybe we could talk about this because I'd be interested. I mean, I have often thought that one nice application would be that if you could imagine these kind of lines of argument. So imagine a kind of Argupedia. It's a little project I get my students to do where people debate user arguments, and you could imagine crowdsourcing to determine the relevance, let's say, of any given premise with respect to a claim. I mean, you could have some kind of Turk that really tries to get to engage humans in rating, let's say, the relevance of a particular premise to a claim. I mean, that's something I thought is a nice application area that's not really been looked at.
And this happens a lot, I mean, at a much more mundane level on things like Stack Overflow and so on, other websites where people rate various contributions, right? Yeah. So you could that's what I was getting at. Okay, you can get to a point where the humans provide something that allows you to get a number. And you essentially, in the argument framework, you don't understand why, but you can use that number.
Yeah, I think that would be a really nice, and again, I know people work on crowdsourcing. That would be a nice research area to kind of develop, actually. It's something that I've often thought would be really nice, but I've never really had an opportunity to explore it.
You need to have a rating. I think you need to have a rating for the argument itself, and then, or the truth of the argument, and then another rating for the relevance of that argument in respect to what it is supposed to be counter-attacking. You have to have both, otherwise.
Yeah, you have to have ratings on the validity of the inference, the inferential support within an argument, internal to, as well as ratings on whether one argument is a counter or a valid counter argument to another.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
So let's continue with this dialogue. So now let's imagine, so we're at this stage. Now, agent 1 says, okay, I've got an argument against your argument for S, G since M. So this gets added to the commitment store. And now, of course, we can see that there is an argument for G. We can take the commitment store, we construct the arguments and attacks, and we now see that there is now a winning argument for Q. So at this stage in the dialogue, agent 1 has successfully persuaded agent 2 that Q is true. Okay. So now you can see, hopefully, the sort of over the course of this tutorial, I've tried to why it was important to kind of expose you to the kind of the logical instantiations of argument frameworks and evaluating justified arguments, and how you can use these notions of frameworks instantiated by logics, evaluating justified arguments to determine outcomes of dialogues. Okay. So, of course, we need now to specify. It's not just simply a question of whatever's asserted putting in the commitment store. We need to specify the effects of locutions on the commitment store. So in this case, Agent 1 says Q. Agent 2 says why Q. Agent 1 says, well, Q since P, not SP. So at this stage, we've asserted into the commitment store the content Q and the argument for Q. Q since the rule, Q since P, not S, and the fact P. So whatever the content of this locution is the rule, Q since P, not S, and the fact P. Now, agent 2 says why P. Okay, so agent 1, suppose agent 1 now retracts P. Of course, that means that, okay, so hang on. So we got P. Agent 1 retracts P, so that means P needs to be removed from the commitment store. So I'm talking now about the effects of locutions on the commitment store. Okay. Now, let's also have a look at the dialectical role of non-assertional locutions. Supposing agent 1 claims Q, agent 2 says why Q, agent 1 argues, well, Q since P, not S, and I've got the fact P. Then agent 2 says, well, why P? At this stage, if you look at the commitment store, okay, just gone, it went haywire. Okay, so at this stage, right? So we've got Q, the rule Q, if P not S and P. Agent 2 says why P. But if we construct the argument framework, we just get a single argument for Q. Q since P not S and P. But can agent 1 be said to have persuaded agent 2? No, because there's a burden of proof on agent 1 to justify why P is the case. So interestingly enough, what you can do, and this is some work done by, initiated by Henry Pracken, is you can actually model the effect of YP as an attack. You can see that, YP. This YP attacks the argument that makes use of a premise P, because essentially it's saying, well, look, I don't accept your premise. Give me evidence for you. I'm not going to accept it. It's a dialectical move. Okay? So you can now begin to see actually how you can actually have relations of attack and in fact even support between what I'm trying to do now is going to lead you to the idea that you can have these kinds of relations not just between arguments, but between locutions. When agent 1 claims Q, agent 2 might say, well, why Q? And that could be understood as an attack on the claim. It's like, it's shifting the burden of proof.
So I suppose there is a set of axioms on which both agree, no? Otherwise, one could indefinitely ask why, like a child who always asks, and why this, and why, and why. Yeah, and exactly. Eventually
there
win.
Has to be some, we have to enforce some kind of rationality. Okay, so, and then the fact that once, having been asked to justify Q, agent 1 could move, well, Q since P not SP. Again, this locution could be seen as an attack on this locution. And then agent 2 might ask why P, and this could be seen as an attack on this locution. So this is quite interesting. So what earlier on, I said, okay, they move these, make these locutions, it defines a commitment store, you construct the argument framework from the commitment store, you work out the justified arguments, and that determines who's winning the dialogue. Interestingly enough, you could ignore the construction of the argument framework. There are ways to say, okay, I'm not even going to construct the argument framework. I'm going to use these notions of attack at the level of locutions and evaluate, in a similar way to how you evaluate an argument framework, you evaluate a network of locutions and the relationships between them. This locution is attacking this locution. This locution is attacking this one. Actually, this locution, argue Q since P not S, could be seen also as supporting the earlier locution claim Q. So what you can do, there are ways to sort of, to evaluate the outcome, forget the commitment store and the argument framework. Let me just evaluate the outcome of the dialogue by processing this graph of locutions in a similar way to which I evaluate an argument framework. And it turns out that for certain classes of protocol and dialogue, you can show that just evaluating the graph of locutions, if the locution claim Q is winning, if and only if there is a justified argument from the framework built from the knowledge constructed from the contents of the locutions. Yeah? This is actually work that initiated by Henry Pracken. It's a very nice piece of work because he shows for certain persuasion dialogues, you can just operate at the level of locutions and look at abstract relations between the locutions, work out the winning locution, and that corresponds to the winning claim of the argument justified in the framework built from the contents of the locutions. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. For certain classes, it's equivalent. Under certain conditions, it's equivalent. By intuition, you mean under certain classes. What you want to spell that out? There are certain God, it's quite. I can make it talk quite complex, actually. I mean, you have no locutions surrendering, and surrendering locutions, supporting locutions, attacking locutions, and you process them in a slightly more complex way. I mean, you have to kind of. Anyway, we'll talk about it later on.
You need more restriction on
the protocol itself.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Now. Okay, so that's fine. We've talked about dialogues. We've talked about the construction of the argument framework built from the contents of the locutions. How would we expect to use? What use can we make of the evaluation of the arguments implicitly constructed in the course of a dialogue? How can this provide dialectical feedback? Okay, so I'm now talking about, imagine not just automated agents, but human agents engaging in a dialogue, accepting the fact that they are playing by the rules of the protocol. Okay, what kind of dialectical? Remember, the idea was that argumentation could be used to kind of normatively or rationally guide or guide rational debate and discussion amongst not just automated agents but human agents as well. So what kind of dialectical feedback does the evaluation of the arguments in the framework provide to the agents, the interlocutors debating? Here's some examples. As I've already described, you can use the evaluation of the justified arguments will tell you who is currently winning the dialogue. Yeah, I've given you a few examples of that. The agents can be informed, okay, so-and-so is currently winning. Okay. The feedback, you can use the argumentation, for underlying argumentation formalism to suggest moves that you could possibly move. You should move Z, argument Z. Here's a counter-argument that is a valid argument, and you can use it. You'll see why in a second. Also, it can inform you as to what the relevant moves are to reply to. Let's have a couple of examples. Imagine agent 1, from its classical knowledge base, constructs an argument A. A since A, just a fact. Agent 2 says, well, I've got a counter-argument. Given B and B implies not A, then not A is true. Now, from the commitments, so we add to the commitment store A and B implies not A. Then we construct the argument graph, like remember the classical logic example. And from A and B implies not A, one can construct an argument for not B, Z. And this argument Z counterattacks Y, because it claims not B. So in other words, from the knowledge exchange in the locutions, there is an additional argument, Z, that agent 1 could use to counterattack Y. Argue not B since A. And interestingly enough, agent 1 is allowed not just to use its own knowledge A, but also the knowledge provided by agent 2, i.e. B implies not A. It's a bit like a kind of hang yourself argument. I mean, this is commonly the case in debate where, you know, if you are, I mean, Socrates would use this technique quite a lot. So he would, given your assumptions, what you've said, then together with this, which you conceivably hold to be true, I can prove a contradiction. I can show you contradict yourself. You know, right? So that's what agent 1 is doing. It's making use of agent 2 knowledge together with what it knows to move a counter argument. Okay. Also, you can identify the relevant moves to reply to. Look at this dialogue. Pro, agent 1 is currently winning. It says P since not G. Agent 2 says, well, G since not H. Agent 1 says, well, H since not M. And then agent 2 successfully counterattacks with M since not E. Then agent 1 moves H since not Q. An alternative way, so agent 1 has first tried to show that H is provable, but that attempt here is successfully counterattacked by agent 2. So agent 1 backtracks, okay, I've got an alternative argument for H. Now at this stage in the dialogue, it makes no sense for agent 2, the red agent, to move an alternative counter-argument to M, because that won't change the outcome. The only way agent 1 can be shown to be losing is by attacking this argument, H if not Q. Okay? It's a bit like the winning strategy. Right? This is the winning strategy here. This is the argument that needs, it's no point moving an argument. This is not relevant. It's not a relevant move to attack this, because agent 2 really must attack this argument to win the game. H since not Q. Can you see that? From the you know? Okay. So far I've described persuasion dialogues in which one agent attempts to persuade another agent of the truth of a claim. Right? And I appealed to the idea that you've got these argument frameworks, which I discussed in the first part, where I discussed epistemic argumentation, right? Arguments for the truth of the matter. And these argument frameworks can be used to provide dialectical feedback in these dialogues, what moves you can make, what moves are relevant to reply to, who's currently winning the dialogue. You remember also, I very briefly at the end of the last session mentioned variations, argumentation formalisms, which are not just epistemic, but practical argumentation about what to do. So there are a number of researchers look at argumentation, practical reasoning, where the arguments are providing supporting reasons for a course of action. Now, just in the same way as the argumentation frameworks for epistemic reasoning can provide dialectical feedback for persuasion dialogues, persuading somebody of the truth of the matter, so one can also define deliberation dialogues in which the arguments exchanged are for alternative courses of action, deciding what to do when multiple agents have decided to decide together to go to the restaurant or whatever, and the framework in the background providing the dialectical feedback are those other frameworks I discussed where they account for practical argumentation about what to do, practical reasoning. Okay? So that's, I mean, I haven't got time to go into these deliberation dialogues, but in a similar spirit, as I've discussed with persuasion and epistemic argumentation, similarly with deliberation and practical reasoning argumentation. Also, there are negotiation dialogues, another area of research. And these are much richer than, so you know the typical handshaking protocols in negotiation. Imagine a computational negotiation sequence where somebody's trying to sell you a car, a seller agent. Offer Renault, reject Renault. Okay, offer BMW, reject. It's just handshaking. In an argumentation-based negotiation dialogue, you can develop much richer accounts of negotiation, where you might, for example, query why you are rejecting. So imagine the seller agent says, why not? Here's a Renault for sale. The buyer agent says, I reject that offer. The seller agent says, why reject Renault? The buyer agent says, well, because Renaults are unsafe. The seller agent comes up with a counter argument. Well, but look, according to the European Union report, Renaults are very safe. So now you can see how that even the quality of the negotiation is enhanced and enriched, and may lead to acceptance and acceptance of offers that would not otherwise be accepted without the kind of more richer argumentation. Also notice in this case that we are transitioning from we have a kind of embedded or nested persuasion dialogue. You start with a negotiation dialogue, and then one agent tries to persuade the other that in fact Renaults are safe. So there's a whole lot of work at transitioning dialogue types beginning with a top-level dialogue for negotiation, then a nested persuasion dialogue.
So I wanted to come back to you about something that you said earlier about the need for somebody making a claim to actually have that as a consequence of their knowledge base, which I think that's an unnecessary thing. And I think the deliberation dialogue and the negotiation dialogue both illustrate that, because in neither case is the original suggestion that you're making something that you can deduce from your knowledge base. So you don't know that an offer of Renault will be accepted or whatever. You know reason. Or if I say, let's all go to Pizza Express, then there's no reason to say that that's actually the best choice. It's something that you're floating as a possibility. And then you're looking to see whether counterexamples or counter-arguments are proffered to that, to see whether that survives the argument. You're not really believing it necessarily up front. And I think another example of that is hypothetical reasoning, particularly when you're trying to come to a hypothesis. So Crick says to Watson, I think DNA is a helix. Then Watson says, well, but then the X-ray crystallography evidence would look like this, and it doesn't. And then Crick says, yeah, but supposing it was a double helix. And oh no, Watson says, yes, the X-ray crystallography data would match that. So, they're sort of floating hypotheses. They don't have any evidence for them. So it's not a conclusion from their knowledge base. It's something that they're just trying to see if there's any counterexamples to whether the evidence would support it.
Very nice. I mean, actually, that second example, I'll come to both points, but interesting point. The second one, so there are what's called information seeking and inquiry dialogues that specifically model that kind of scenario. In the first case, where in the practical deliberation, it may well be the case that I, from my own practical reasoning, have a preference for a particular option, going to the Indian rather than the Italian, which I would imagine everybody would agree with as a preferable option. But what's interesting also is that one nice way, I mean, I'm not sure if this has been, I've thought about it, I'm not sure whether this has actually sort of been explored necessarily formally in the literature, but I do think that in a deliberation, unlike a persuasion, this comes to an earlier point I think you were making, in a deliberation dialogue, it might be quite reasonable for you to attack your own argument, okay, because you might be suggesting something, and then in the interests of the common good, because you all want to, collaboratively, deliberatively decide upon a course of action that's acceptable to all, you might say, okay, actually, given what you've said, I can suggest counter-arguments by initial suggestion. And I think that's what... Yeah. You actually don't... Yeah. So but I think there is that kind of, that you could draw that kind of distinction, and I think that's related to what you were saying. Okay. So here's some more. I just scratched the surface on dialogues. Here's some more on, as I said, there are information-seeking inquiry dialogues. There's strategizing and dialogue. So one thing I'm working on with a PhD student of mine, Christos, we're looking at. Imagine I'm having this is quite common, of course. If you're having a really kind of vigorous debate, let's say persuasion dialogue, about some topic, of course, you can strategize, right? At any choice, at any point in a dialogue, I might have a choice of which argument to move against you. And it would help me if I have a model of your knowledge to decide, because it may be, if I move argument X, I have strong reasons to believe that you have a Y that attacks my X. I will lose. Right? But if I move an argument Z, I have strong reason to believe that you have no counter argument to my Z. So we're getting into strategizing. And what Christos is looking at is how do you build models of your interlocutor's knowledge? Theory of other minds, effectively, if you want a fancy term for it, right? But I mean, it's basically just, and this you can construct from the history of the dialogues up to now. So what's been revealed to me about the contents of your knowledge base. Okay. Also, it may be that if in many dialogues, whenever I moved an argument against the invasion of Syria, a regularly moved counter-argument has been, well, this would lead to instability in the region, then there's an increased likelihood that the next person I have a dialogue who argues against invading Syria will also be aware of that argument. Okay, so there's a whole, you can imagine now, it gets really quite complex and actually very interesting to sort of see how can we develop models of other agents' knowledge that we can then use to strategize in dialogues, persuasion dialogues.
Appeal to them, or
Yes,
maybe
yes.
insult them, or whatever kind of game you want to play.
So earlier I talked about these frameworks for practical reasoning, where the arguments are about what to do, but they've also been applied to epistemic reasoning. But this is the work by Bench Capon and K.E. Atkinson, but specifically more Trevor Bench Capon, where associated with each argument is a value. The value that the argument promotes, the action. So given some action A, we should do A because it achieves some state of the world which promotes a value that's desirable.
Okay.
Now, there may be an alternative action, argument for alternative action, that promotes another value. And these two values, you decide which wins based upon an ordering on the values, which value is more important than the other value. And that may depend upon the audience you are addressing. So different audiences may have different value orderings, which will determine a different outcome of the decision-making process, of the deliberation.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'll continue with the last section. So we've got six. Is it 6? We're finishing now, are we? Oh, right. Okay. Can I just? Huh? Okay. Okay. Very, very quickly. You know, I mean, essentially, this is the picture we're looking at, right? We've got a dialogue manager that implements a protocol. You've got this evaluation of arguments, and you've got locutions between agents, and you've got dialectical guidance. I mean, that's the picture. Okay. The ideal would be also to have human agents involved in these dialogues, with the dialogue manager implementing a protocol and dialectical guidance. And you can imagine setting this setting in you know, as I try to kind of pump your intuitions with regard to ontologies or crowdsourcing or whatever. And then, well, I won't go into too much detail, but one enabling methodology for getting humans involved is the use of screens and critical questions. Anybody heard of these? These come from work in the philosophical community, but they're basically generic templates for arguments, which you could imagine being instantiated by in logical languages or natural language. So this will be a generic argument for action. In circumstances R, doing action A will result in circumstances S, which achieves goal G, which promotes value V. So you could imagine this is a generic argument for doing a particular action. And the critical questions identify presuppositions in the argument that can be assumptions in the argument that can be questioned. Okay. Here's another argument from expert opinion. E is an expert in domain D. Proposition P is in domain D. E asserts P is true or false. Therefore, P may be plausibly taken to be true or false. Here are some critical questions. How credible is E an expert? In this argument for action, is it the case that R is true, that the circumstances as described are true? And there are 16 of them. I just want to, look, just to give you a flavor. You can use these critical questions to ask the proponent of the argument to justify why an assumption, or as pointers to counter-arguments. So here's an example. In circumstances, Assad has chemical weapons. We should invade Syria, which will remove Assad from power, which will achieve the goal of removal of chemical weapons, and so promote world peace. A critical question is S true? In other words, for that particular variable, is it the case that Assad has chemical weapons? So now the burden of proof is on providing an argument for this assumption. Yes, Hans Blick, who was from the Iraq days, is an expert in domains of chemical weapons, and he says Assad has chemical weapons. Okay, actually, it should be the other way around anyway. Okay, so then another critical question for this argument could be an alternative. Another expert asserts the opposite. The UN expert says Assad does not have chemical weapons. So here, the critical question, which says, is it the case? One of the critical questions for the expert opinion scheme is an alternative view from an alternative expert? And that critical question, unlike here, is not posed as a question as such. It's posed to identify another argument that could instantiate another scheme. And you can then organize these into an argument graph. Sorry, I rushed that because I know we're running out of time. But the take-home message here is that the schemes and critical questions almost can be used to map out the dialectical space of reasoning and can be instantiated by both logical agents and human agents. Okay, through these common templates. And that's how one way to integrate kind of computational and human agents in argumentative processes. Okay, I'll conclude. So to conclude, okay, so what I've tried to do basically in the tutorial is start with instantiating argument frameworks from given logics, and then showing how you can develop argument game proof theories, which in turn can be generalized to dialogues, in which dialectical feedback can be provided to the communicators, the interlocutors in the dialogue, to provide dialectical feedback. I've tried to strongly argue for the case that argumentation is a particularly appropriate formalism for distributed reasoning and for integrating humans into the loop. And I think this might be relevant to many of you working in ontologies or in crowdsourcing. How do we integrate computation and human reasoning so each can enrich and inform the other? Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Any more questions for Sanjay?
Everyone's tired, and I had a lot of questions during, which I thank you all for. I actually prefer that the questions come during the course of the tutorial rather than at the end. It's much nicer.
So I think this has been a very interesting tutorial. It also overlaps, tries to shed light on phenomena that are quite similar to the ones that we saw in the tutorial on dialogue. And therefore, gives two different perspectives. And since we're interested in humans and agents, I think probably a lot of the work that some of the people in this project will do will lie somewhere in the middle. And that's a really, really exciting prospect. And so let's thank Sanjay again.
And I would just add, a rich area for exploration in terms of research is to actually try to find a sort of marriage between the kind of dialogue work presented by David yesterday and this. That's not really, it's not a well-developed, mature field in terms of the intersection between the two areas.